Alright, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be discussing Unsettled Matters. Tom Bleecker is a writer. Bruce Lee is stuck in the netherworld. But in this new buddy cop movie, they're gonna be coming together because they need to find Chong E Itsu and finally solve the mystery of Bruce's death. Let's get to it.
And every day, I practice martial arts.
Yo, Mikey, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Seagon. How are you?
Good. Very happy to see you across from me today because we have a serious episode here today, man.
Absolutely. You know, I'm realizing I don't think I've actually done a full episode in this current setup. I think because it does feel very weird being so far away from you.
I know, right? Because it doesn't look that way in camera. Mm-hmm. It looks like we're just sitting across a short table, but it does, as we mentioned before, have that Batman kind of feeling, the Michael Keaton Batman, where he's having his dinner date with Vicky Vale across that very long table. And it's like, hey,
absolutely.
How are you doing?
Hi, can you pass me the salt?
Yes, we have mics and laptops in between us. So anyway, we are doing a special episode today. Not our normal, off-the-cuff shenanigans about Bruce Lee and Wing Chun and whatnot. A lot of people responded very favorably to the somewhat deep dive we did in the final months of Bruce Lee's life. And so I've decided, based on some recommendations from some of our Patreons and general vibes and things that I've been getting in the comments for a while, to break down the infamous Unsettled Matters, the book written by Tom Bleecker.
Absolutely.
Which was like a big bombshell when it came out in the mid-90s, because it was like, the book that didn't pull any punches and was going to tell you all the dirt about Bruce Lee. Mm-hmm. Written by Tom Bleecker, who was very briefly married to Linda Lee, the widow of Bruce Lee. So it had all the trappings of being the book that, has all the info in it. And because this is very similar to when we did the final months of Bruce Lee, I used a blog post which kind of chronicled all the dates and times and everything. Because I want to go through this in detail, I've decided that I'll do the same thing. So I prepared a little bit. All right, this is not KFG off the cuff. I feel these are prepared statements. And so just to make sure that we were thorough and that I had a little bit of time to think about it, because while it's fun to do the off the cuff podcast where I'm just kind of riffing about things about Bruce Lee or, my wheelhouse of teaching Wing Chun, this is something where there's lots of details and facts. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't misspeak, or that I at least thought about it for a few minutes before I said something for forever and ever to stay for posterity on YouTube. So what I want to do first, before we even start breaking down the book, and I don't know how many episodes this is going to take. Today's episode is going to, I think, be the primer for what we're going to be doing in the subsequent episodes, because for people who are new to like Tom Bleecker's book, or maybe they didn't read Unsettled Matters, I feel that it wouldn't make sense if I just started to go, look, this is good, this is true, this is bullshit. We need to kind of set the stage so people who don't know about this book know a little bit about it. Make sure that people understand what my reasons are for doing this. And then I think the subsequent episodes are not going to be in this format at all. They're going to be a lot more like, okay, in these chapters, these are the claims that Mr. Bleecker made. Here's where I agree with him. Here's where I disagree with him. And here's where I think no one actually knows, although he's claiming to know. So I think those are going to be a little bit more kind of rapid fire, but I need to set the stage. So I have written essentially a prepared statement. So if you don't mind, and I know it's a little weird for our podcast viewers to for me to just sit here and read something that I'm not like trying to discuss, but like read something because this is what I want to say. So here we go. All right. Are you ready?
Before you read your prepared statement, just don't forget that the best way to support the Kung Fu Genius
is on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Kung Fu Genius for all your Kung Fu Genius needs. For as little as $5 a month, you can get access to episodes early. Higher levels of support yield all sorts of goodies, including the highest, which is the baller level. You can get a private episode with me. And if you don't want to support us on Patreon, you can support us here on YouTube with YouTube memberships. We have a couple tiers for that. The lower level tiers is like a couple bucks, just basically saying a thank you to us. The highest tier, which I think is about $9.99 a month, you get access to some of my special episodes that are like insider only, which we're going to be doing a lot more. And those episodes are also available for our Patreons at the previewer level, I think, and above. Or the second tier. I forget what the name of the tiers are. It's like the $10 and above tier. So it's comparable to YouTube. And so we're going to have all sorts of special goodies there, which may include stuff about this topic. So there may be some things where I maybe don't feel as comfortable putting it to the broad public, so I may just put it for our members only.
Absolutely.
Like, let me tell you what I really think about this, all right? Now that you spent so many hours listening to my public statements, now let me tell you what I actually think about this, right? So here we are, all right? So I feel like I'm going to court, have my prepared statement. So finally, here comes the deep dive into Tom Bleecker's 1996 book, Unsettled Matters. I read this book sometime between 96 to about 98, so very shortly from when it came out. It was eye-opening to me because everything I had read about Bruce Lee through like the magazines and the books that came out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, most of that was generally like very glowing and positive. In my mid-teens, I did read Alex Ben Block's book, The Legend of Bruce Lee, which did discuss his use of cannabis. So the drug stuff wasn't anything new to me by the time I picked up Bleecker's book. I think most people who picked up Bleecker's book, that was the first time they read about it, but that wasn't, I'm such a Bruce Lee nerd, that wasn't even my first time hearing about it. What was new to me was that this was the first time someone seemed to try to kick Bruce down a peg. Even if that wasn't Bleecker's intention, it was like, as a hardcore teenage Bruce Lee fan, that's how I felt. Like he's trying to kick him down a peg. And that may not be his intentions. It's just, I'm sure people feel the same way when they watch my drug letters video, and that's not my intention with that at all. Despite that feeling, I couldn't stop reading this book. I even lent it to my girlfriend at the time, who found it equally fascinating. Although I didn't like a lot of the things that were said, because Bruce was my hero since I was 8, I did accept it as fact. Pretty uncritically, as a matter of fact. I thought, as many who read that book probably did and still do, that I was now like one of the few insiders who knew something about Bruce that the casuals didn't know. I told people of the cortisone, the use of the diuretics, and Wong, the shady butler, and all of that. Basically, all the nonsense sock puppet accounts here on YouTube drop in my comments when they think they're the only ones who read Bleecker's book was exactly what I said to people privately like over 10 years ago, which is why it's always funny when people drop those Bleeckerisms into the comments like, well, KFG, you might not know about the kidneys and the cortisone. It's like, bro, calm down. All right. That's why I need to put this here. Like, I read this book more or less when it came out when I was a teenager. So you need to like pump the brakes on thinking that KFG somehow missed Unsettled Matters. So for years, I even recommended Unsettled Matters to my own students that asked me about Bruce Lee's death and personal life. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that I started to get a second wind in my love of Bruce Lee, that I started to read and reread new and old books about Bruce. I began to notice that there were some issues with Bleecker's book, not just the stuff about Bruce's death or his health, but with Bleecker's characterization of things like Hong Kong triads, the American martial arts scene, his like very Kempo-centric way of looking at the, martial arts universe at that time. We're about to embark on what's likely my 28th trip to Hong Kong. I've spent countless hours discussing Bruce Lee with people who can really be considered insiders, both in Hong Kong and here in the States. In addition to these conversations, recent years have seen the release of many items that were either like once private or just impossible to get a hold of. A lot of Bruce's notes, a lot of his daytimer entries, interviews with people who knew him, and general access has increased tremendously through the internet. We can now easily access Bruce's complete autopsy report, the toxicology, the testimony at the inquest of his death, all of which is compiled in Marcus Okanya's great book, The Death of Bruce Lee, and of course, the 2021 bombshell of The Drug Letters of Bob Baker, which can all be read online, or you can watch my video to get that information. So the access to information is incredible, and we no longer need to rely on a single book like Unsettled Matters to interpret this information for us. Think back then, before we really had this access, like you needed a book like Unsettled Matters written by someone who had seen some of this stuff to tell you what's on there, right? But nowadays, you don't need to accept the narrative in a book because you can literally read all that stuff yourself. As a result, the biggest cracks I found in recent years were in Bleecker's interpretation of certain events, and in particular, the sheer amount of stuff he didn't seem to know. As someone who is married to Linda Lee briefly, we would expect Tom to know quite a bit more than most, but it's in the recent revelations of what Tom didn't know that calls into question his conclusions that he so passionately emphasized. It calls into question his motivations on how many of the assertions he made in his book, or how many of the assertions were made in his book, especially knowing now how much of it appears to be wrong in hindsight. I'm sure Tom would counter by saying that he knew things, but he couldn't say them. But seriously, Unsettled Matters was a book that was marketed on its not pulling any punches about Bruce Lee. I think you and I can rest assured that if Tom knew about the cocaine use, as an example, it would be on every page of that book, all right? It's not. Absent this key fact, it makes most of what's in there seem like simple tabloid guesswork, and not the insight of an insider who seemingly had access to documents that most of us can just Google now. Full disclosure, we try to keep things somewhat lighthearted on this podcast. There are going to be times when I make fun of Mr. Bleecker, and it may seem that I'm moving from keeping it like just about the facts. However, these points where I make fun of something he writes will be to point out conflicts in what we like now know, or to point out like weird quirks in Mr. Bleecker's line of argumentation that pop up again and again. History is not just about reading out data points, but it's also in trying to find out the most correct interpretation of those data points. I'm going to argue that while Tom did get stuff correct, it's not like everything in his book is wrong. His interpretation of other data points leaves something to be desired. Whether he completely made it up to write a compelling book, whether he fudged some of it, or whether he is completely convinced of what he wrote, I'll let our viewers decide. If human nature is any indication, he probably does believe some of it at least, regardless of how he came up with his information. But I must say that conviction of an opinion or the passion by which someone states a narrative is no indication of whether that narrative is fact. I certainly don't know all the answers, but I just wanted to point out where I think something seems off. I may use humor for that. That's just the way these videos are going to go. If Mr. Bleecker feels that I have made a statement in error, he is more than welcome to come on my podcast to correct my interpretation. But I will ask for receipts. The burden of proof rests on the one making the claims. Unsettled Matters is full of claims. I don't believe Mr. Bleecker has come close to meeting his burden of proof on some of his claims. He is always welcome on my podcast to substantiate said claims. He can even make fun of me if it makes him feel better. Finally, the reason why I want to do this is because anytime I discuss something about Bruce's untimely demise, or his final days, or his health issues, as best as we outsiders can possibly understand them, I get comments that just copy and paste talking points from Bleecker's book as if they're substantiated and indisputable facts. People like a counter narrative because it often makes them feel that they know something that the unwashed masses don't know. That's how I felt when I first read his book. That's why people will go for things that sound salacious, especially when it disagrees with public perception. I'm not saying Bruce was a saint. Bruce himself said that he wasn't a saint in his Ted Thomas interview. But just to throw a bunch of seedy stuff on the wall to see what sticks without any accountability is not responsible reporting. I feel that Tom Bleecker's book, either like when it originally came out and even to this day, it gets like bashed childishly by fanboys. I just want to state that that's not where this is coming from. Or it gets taken as the gospel truth from, the same type of people who probably could believe the earth is flat if the right charismatic person presented the facts to them. And to believe in every conspiracy theory is just as stupid as believing that there are no conspiracies at all. There's nothing secretive about what we're going to discuss here. Everything I point out to you, you can look up. One can't really do the same for a lot of the things in Bleecker's book. As far as I can tell, Unsettled Matters has never received what's hopefully competent. We'll let the viewers decide if this is competent or any kind of critical pushback. So I think it's time for it. So let's get to it, Mikey.
Fantastic.
All right.
Let's
So anyway, that was my prepared statement because I just wanted to make sure that I didn't just like run into it without like making it very clear why I'm doing this, because I think any critique of Tom Bleecker's book may get from a certain demographic of the very weird people who are into Bruce Lee stuff. Like, oh, you're just a fanboy. You don't want to hear anything bad about Bruce Lee. Bro, I'm literally the one who revealed the drug letters. Okay. I'm the first one to do a YouTube video on it, which I still get tons of shit for. I have no problem talking openly about the less than favorable things that happen in his life because I feel that's it. Like, as Bruce would say, to be honest and to express yourself. We want to know what was going on in his life. These things have nothing to do with his amazing achievements. And I talk about those on other videos. Like, when people watch these videos, they get the impression that like this is all we talk about. And I mean, how many in all the years we've been doing this podcast, how often do I talk about his brilliance, his genius, his great contributions and stuff? It's just that when people watch this, they get the impression that this is the main thing that we're about, and that the only reason either that I'm one of the guys who also bashes Bruce Lee like a fanboy, like the fanboys will hate, or now that I'm going to go against some of the stuff that Tom Bleecker wrote. Now I'll then also be criticized as a fanboy. So the funny thing is, like, you literally can't win. Talk about the cocaine stuff. You're not a real Bruce Lee fan. Get his effing name out your mouth. Talk critically about other people who've spoken critically about Bruce Lee. Now you're a fanboy. And so it's like, at some point you just got to stop giving a shit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So what if you could transport back in time for a front row seat into the life and legacy of one of the most respected Wing Chun masters in history? Gong Sao Wong, a tribute direct students on Sifu Wong Sao Leung, offers you just that. Through a series of exclusive conversations, 25 direct students share anecdotes, reflections, and personal stories offering in-depth understanding of the man behind the legend. Order your copy today across 12 Amazon marketplaces with free shipping. I absolutely love this book, and I think you'll find it an indispensable part of your collection. I can't recommend it enough. Get yours today. Go to Amazon, type in Gong Sao Wong, and there you go.
So before we get started, here's a question I have for you. Bearing in mind how protective the Lee estate is over stuff to the point that they have a tendency to put out basically nonsense, as opposed to like stuff that either like involves any kind of critical thought or, is Bleecker's book, would it be maybe considered an unofficial biography?
So from what I can tell, they did try to stop publication of it. Bleecker's book has no photos in it.
Oh, wow.
Because, obviously they're going to go after him if he uses Bruce's image. And from what I didn't know it. I knew the book was somewhat controversial when it came out. I don't know how, especially given that this is essentially Linda Lee's ex-husband, there must have been some shit going on back and forth. Some of that stuff is actually in the introductory chapter, which is what we're going to discuss today. Today, we're basically, I had my little long preamble there, and we're going to discuss the introductory chapter. And then in the subsequent episodes, we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of some of the stuff he said. From what I can tell, they were really trying to stop this thing from getting out there. But clearly they didn't do it. I mean, there are a lot of people who are afraid of what the Lee estate is going to do in terms of like, suing you if you talk about Bruce Lee or whatever. And the truth is that Bruce Lee is a public figure. You can't necessarily use his image to sell your brand. You have to be careful when you use photos because the person who owns the person who took the photo is the copyright holder. So if you can get photos of Bruce that were taken that are somehow not within the purview of the Lee estate, you can use them. All right. And anyone can write a book about Bruce Lee. The Lee estate can write all the letters they want. They even wrote some kind of nasty letters when Pauly's book was about to come out. And so when Matt Pauly, which is like Simon & Schuster, I believe, it's like a major publishing house.
Yeah.
He, originally was he originally interviewed even Shannon Lee. And I think the moment that they found out that like Matt Pauly was going to talk to Betty Ting Pei, that's when they didn't want anything to do with it. Because now, you're listening to everyone, not just our, whitewashed version of Bruce Lee. And then they no longer endorsed it. And from what I can tell, they can write some letters, and that's about it. So I think even if they tried to go after Tom, I don't think they really have any teeth. He's a public figure. You or me could write a book about Bruce Lee, Elvis, any of these. It's not an issue.
Right. Yeah. It just sort of strikes me in my younger years when I used to read an awful lot of rock biographies, and I would occasionally read these ones again, same as you. I remember reading this Talking Heads one I got when I was a lot younger. I loved Talking Heads so much, and being, oh wow, all of this new information is amazing. And it's like, I was probably like 13 or 14, and my mum and dad just being like, they really don't like David Byrne, do they? And it took me a few years to realize that as I read it as an older person, that like, whoever it felt when I reread it, that whoever wrote the book had an agenda.
Yes.
And it was like, they really painted David Byrne in such a terrible, David Byrne's a bit of a crazy person anyway, but like, they really went after him in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was like, in my experience, it seems that like, with some official biographies, obviously, they whitewash all of the stuff, you know what I mean? But I think there are some people that maybe you get a good all-round thing.
Yeah,
you know
I think
mean?
Matt Pauly's book is that book. It doesn't really pull any punches on, say Bruce's affairs or what was known of his drug use at the time of that book, basically pre-drug letters. And but at the same time, it doesn't bash him at all. It gets the perfect balance. Whereas Bleecker's book, you have the feeling like the dude's got an axe to grind, which is something we'll also discuss. Now, mind you, okay, because there's something called the genetic fallacy, all right? If, let's say, where people say, like, well, who are you to say anything about Bruce Lee because you're just like the sour grapes ex-husband of Bruce's, like, widow or whatever, right? And the truth is that's actually not a proper line of argumentation, because a fact is a fact no matter who says it. It's actually called the genetic fallacy. You know what I mean? If like Mussolini were to come back today and walk into this room, and he would like look at your Wing Chun punch and he would critique it, if that critique was legit, it doesn't matter that he's like a murderous dictator. All right. Mm-hmm. Because the critique was legit, but people go like, well, you're a murderous dictator. Who are you to tell me how to punch in Wing Chun? Right. But the thing is, if something is correct, it doesn't matter. So I mean, on one hand, to say that it feels like Tom Bleecker has an axe to grind, because he may have gotten pushed out of being part of the Dragon the Bruce Lee story movie that came, because the book that was used as the source material was the one that he was kind of ghostwriting with Linda. So there's a lot of ways you can go like, he's clearly like he got pushed out of this Hollywood deal and he's kind of sour grapes and blah, 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 blah. But even that doesn't mean that what he puts in his book is not true. All right. But I will say that it probably still also isn't true. So anyway, so now we're going to discuss the introduction, all right, which is just called Introduction, all right? I'm going to paraphrase most of the talking. I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to paraphrase some of the talking points with a little bit of comments. You, of course, more than welcome to chime in, because I know some of this stuff will be new to you. And if it's new to you, it might be new to some of the people in our audience. And then we'll go from there. So the introduction kind of starts, Tom Bleecker's a writer. So, he has to like set the stage. He has to have some kind of, it's like you don't just start. It's like, it's got to be like, he's in Ed Parker's Kempo karate school, because Tom Bleecker was an Ed Parker Kempo karate. I believe he was a black belt, but he was he's a Kempo karate guy, which is something that just like people who are vegans and vegetarians, there's no way you will not know that and not hear about it multiple times in the book, all right? Mm-hmm. About how dangerous Ed Parker was and everything like that, right? So it starts off with like how hardcore Ed Parker's Kempo karate school was in the 60s, comparing it to the Wild Bunch. They had Hell's Angels and bodybuilders and ex-felons, all these kind of like, these kind of rapscallions training there, right? And, it's the kind of tough you would never see like in a modern MMA gym, right? You just can't compare like modern tough guy MMA is tattooed with like what a karate school in mid 60s LA must have been like, right? And then, you know, and of course, like everyone, like, you know, my karate instructors when I was younger, I mean, I looked at them like they were like these gods, right? And he still does that, except he's an adult. So, you know, Ed Parker was like 6 feet tall, 220, and he's clearly very impressed with his master, right? As one should be. There's nothing wrong with that. But then he like has this throwaway line where it's like, he's thought by many to be as fast and as powerful as Muhammad Ali. All right. Look, I never met the late Ed Parker. He was obviously he's like an institution of American martial arts. So his contributions to the karate scene, and obviously his famous Long Beach International Tournament, which also helped launch Bruce Lee's career. We have a lot to thank Ed Parker for. I think in hindsight, you know, after kind of now what we know about the truth about martial arts and, you know, what's effective and what's not, it's a little funny in hindsight to look at like certain types of karate guys as being like, oh no, this guy's as fast and as good as Muhammad Ali. Where I go, some people say that. Let me guess, those people are probably his students. Yeah. All right. I don't think any boxers were thinking that. And then after that, with, you know, while he's kind of setting the scene of what's going on in the Ed Parker School, he has what could be considered. Now, I'm not saying it's a subtle dig, but it sounds like a subtle dig at the late Larry Hartzell. The late Larry Hartzell was someone who later became a student of Bruce Lee and then later continued his Jeet Kune Do training under Dan Inosanto. And then Larry Hartzell became one of the almost like the pillars of the early JKD days. And he was also credited, I believe, as the one who really started to introduce the grappling influence into JKD. So Larry Hartzell was, you know, by all accounts, he was a tough dude, very knowledgeable, good grappler, strong. I once talked about in a very early episode of the Kung Fu Genius podcast that I exchanged some emails with him like when I was a teenager, and he was really super sweet to me. Yeah. But Larry Hartzell, like a lot of Bruce's early students, was a former Ed Parker Kempo guy. Dan Inosanto was a former Ed Parker Kempo guy, right? And it seems that at some point there was kind of like a mass exodus of Parker students to Bruce Lee's school, which can kind of account, I think, for some undertones of defensiveness when it comes to, you know, like some people thought Bruce Lee was all right, but, you know, let me tell you how great Ed Parker was, right? When in reality, Ed Parker lost a lot of his top black belts to Bruce Lee. So anyway, so there's like a little dig where he's talking about like, you know, there's like a little mark on the wall or something where like, you know, this guy, Bob Cook, who's presumably an Ed Parker karate guy, you know, kicked Larry Hartzell dangerously close to the plate glass mirrors, right? Just look, I'm not saying it's a dig, but it's kind of like anyone who knows who Larry Hartzell is knows that he later became a student of Bruce Lee. And it's just like, you know, like, yeah, you know, that guy who learned from Bruce Lee, like, yeah, he got like kicked at our karate school. You know what I mean? Yeah. Look, I'm not saying that's what it is, but the reason why I mention it is because Tom Bleecker's book has a pattern of these kind of like subtle digs where it's like subtle enough where if you say, hey, bro, that sounds like a dig on Larry Hartzell. He said, no. I'm just telling you what happened at that time. But it's going to kind of come up again and again that the things that he just kind of brings up happen to, even in a sideways way, kind of kick Bruce or Jeet Kune Do or Bruce's students down just a little notch.
Yeah, it's always that one extra detail that doesn't actually need to be said, right? But exactly, and it gives just enough wiggle room to say, no, bro, like that's just something that happened.
Like, why are you getting so defensive about it? Okay, well, why'd you have to mention Larry Hartzell then? When you just talk about like, oh, there were holes in the walls where people would get kicked.
Yeah,
you have to mention it's the one guy who later learned from Bruce Lee, right? It's like giving him the benefit of the doubt. Okay, it's a random fact, but the problem is it's about the preponderance of evidence. It's not about the one time it happens.
Yeah,
this kind of shit is all over the book. Okay, so then he talks about, of course, because he set the stage for how tough the Ed Parker Karate School is, and then walks in Bruce Lee and James Ian Lee, Bruce's student. He notes that Bruce is well dressed, he's good looking, And he's just a $140, he's just 140 pounds, small guy. And he talked about Bruce walking in, beaming this kind of confidence and being the first man who did not appear intimidated by the massive Parker. And then he goes on saying Bruce was fast and blah, 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 blah. Right. Okay. So, all right. So now, he's basically saying, okay, so he's met Bruce Lee. He comes in, he's impressive, he's good looking. Always okay to give some praise to someone who's dead, because then they're not actively competing with you in terms of like being married to the same person, right? And then comes in the introduction the first claim where I'm going to have to say there's no evidence. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying I kind of know a little bit about Bruce Lee. I've kind of been around. I've seen some stuff. I don't know about this. Tom claims that so after this initial walk-in of Bruce Lee, I'm assuming this is around 64, early mid 60s. Over the next 6 years, since this initial him seeing Bruce Lee, Bleecker claims that he spent a great deal of time with Bruce, both in training together and in the Hollywood film industry, where they shared numerous friends and a common lifestyle. Okay, so here's the first claim where we go, all right, because the problem is if you accept that premise right from the introduction, then he's already put himself in a more intimate relationship with Bruce Lee, which is going to then give more credit to anything else that comes out later. But we have to start right from the beginning, okay? Bruce Lee was one of the most photographed people that like I've ever been into. And this is not in a time like now where photographs, cell phones, everything, like photos were a little more labor intensive in those days. Bruce, from the time he was a child, Bruce, I think, has more photos as a child than I do. And I grew up in the 80s. He has more photos during his time as a young star, in the early period in Seattle. He has tons of photos before he became famous and tons of photos once he became famous. Bruce has photos with everyone, okay? Tom Bleecker claimed to be with Bruce a great deal in training and privately for 6 years. Now, Mikey,
And yes.
I want you to tell me, I want you to ask me how many photos I've seen of Bruce Lee and Tom Bleecker together.
So, KFG, how many photos have you seen of Bruce Lee and Tom Bleecker together?
A 0.
Quick editor's note, we've since discovered there's one photo of Tom Bleecker with Bruce Lee. However, given that there aren't more photos, and given the evidence about to be laid out in the podcast, the intimacy of Bleecker and Lee's relationship and the frequency with which they saw each other is still very much in question. And now, back to the show.
So that's already the first problem. He may have been with Bruce a great deal for 6 years, both privately and in training. But we have zero evidence, okay? On top of this, we have a lot of access to entries in Bruce's daytimers. They've been published, his notes, his letters. There's no letter to Tom Bleecker. There's no entries in his daytimers. Not a single note, nothing. But no photos. 6 years. Tom Bleecker's not in a group photo at the JKD school. And from what I've been told, they kept a logbook at the JKD school. So when you came in, you wrote in your name, like roll call. So they have records of who showed up and how often they showed up. Tom Bleecker, according to the records of the JKD school at that time, he came to one class. And that was on a night when Bruce Lee didn't teach. It was Dan and Asante.
Huh.
So there are no records that he ever really knew Bruce. He may have seen Bruce Lee at Ed Parker School. All right, so maybe that first story is true. But then this extra thing gets smuggled. And I just want to say, we're not even into the stuff Mr. Bleecker is claiming about Bruce's health and death and life and all this other kind of shit, right? And already he has asked us to swallow a huge claim with no evidence. There's none. All right? Absolutely none. 6 years. 6 very well photographed years of Bruce Lee's life. Okay? Now, the next bit I have to kind of preface. All right? he tends to name drop quite a bit. Now, look, all right? Every once in a while, even the KFG will have to say, hey, there was a time I hung out with Leung or whatever. The toad from the Five Deadly Venoms. Because you have to say to tell the story. It's serviceable to the story, right? Mm-hmm. But we know the type of name dropping we're talking about. It's the kind of name dropping that is like to make a point about who you are. Almost like subtly name dropping which of Bruce Lee's students got kicked at the Kenpo Karate School. Mm-hmm. We're also going to subtly name drop all the cool, famous people we know. Now, hey, you can say, hey, it's facts. I was hanging out with those people. But again, it's a pattern that happens again and again. And even in some of Mr. Bleecker's comments on this very channel, he writes a TLDR, like too long didn't read comment, where the first half of it is just like, well, I don't have time to watch podcasts and I just won a Lifetime Achievement Award for writing in Las Vegas. And it's like, and all this kind of stuff about how awesome and how cool he is before he gets to anything. And then he ends up getting to nothing. All right. Doesn't really address anything of substance other than he's too cool to watch my podcast, right? Maybe that's the reason why I'm doing it. I'm just mad that he's not going on my podcast, right? So now, like, the reason why I think the name dropping is a bit problematic is because you get the feeling, and I could be wrong, I'm not a pop psychologist, that he's a little celebrity obsessed. Now, most people who call themselves a writer who live in the LA area, I mean, like, wow, as you would say, shocker, all right? But I think it's problematic when you have someone who clearly is a bit celebrity obsessed, who wants to be the guy who's going to tell you all the inside dirt on Bruce Lee. I'm not saying what he says isn't true. What I'm just trying to point out are patterns and things that make it seem like maybe we need to qualify his statements a little bit better because there's some patterns here that make him not the most reliable narrator on this topic. Okay. So, like people ask me why I don't want, like people say, hey, KFG wants you to like get into movies and do this kind of stuff. It's like, I would love to do behind the scenes consulting and stuff like that. But like in the limited amount of time I have to spend with actors and stunt guys or whatever, including Mike Yan, Jesus Christ. I just like, I think martial arts people are weird. I think a lot of kung fu people are weird, but I can deal with it because I grew up with it. But movie and entertainment people are weird in a way that I just don't want to get used to.
Oh, I studied theater at college, and I wanted to, before I discovered music, I wanted to be a screen actor. That was 100% what I wanted to do.
Right.
Went to college, had to deal with actors, and was like,
yeah.
And I love acting. I love being on stage and that. And I was gutted. I was like, I cannot be around people.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
like the Fight Quest debacle, like dealing with like those producers and stuff. I was like, ugh. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be surrounded by these people. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
And it's like it's weird. And like the name dropping tends to come from people who tend to be more on the insecure end of things. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say this is because like Tom mentions that the day that he found out Bruce Lee died, he was having lunch with Blake Edwards and Julie Andrews. No, it's just a fact, bro. I'm not dropping names. It's just a fact, bro. Mm-hmm. Just to make sure you know I'm kind of an important person, all right? That's why I know. That's why you need to understand my opinion about Bruce Lee, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I think it's weird is because, like, hey, Mikey, you know that I've spent a lot of time with high-level celebrities, right? Mm-hmm. And you know who's never name-dropped a single celebrity name to me? Michael Jackson. Not once did he ever need to name drop some celebrity when I talked to him. Not once. All right.
Hey, you know who else never name dropped anything to me?
Who?
Rihanna.
Yeah. Right? Absolutely. But they don't need to. They're at that level. No, it's like the time I spent in the 80s hanging out with Eddie Murphy. He never would tell me about all these other celebrities. Eddie didn't need to do that. All right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You see how weird that is?
Yeah, very.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like kind of like it there's no good way to do it, right? It always just comes off as like a bit try hard. And then he later goes on, like Ed Parker would pass away, I think, in the late 80s. And, Ed Parker is seemingly a bit of a superhero to Mr. Bleecker. And then he writes that he went to some like tribute party and that Ed Parker was 30 pounds overweight and occasionally had the gout. And then he was like, oh, and he was really surprised that he died of a heart attack 2 years later. So, look, it's not to make light of anyone passing away or whatever. I remember the 80s was when I got into martial art magazines.
Yeah.
I remember seeing Ed Parker in the magazines and just thinking like, because my karate instructor was really fit, my taekwondo instructor was really fit, and just going like, this guy looks really unhealthy. He's supposed to be a karate guy. And like, so even as a kid, I'm like, this guy looks really unhealthy. But apparently, you know, Tom Bleecker is such a detective that he's shocked when someone who's grossly overweight and clearly doesn't look healthy dies of a heart attack, right? So again, it's not to say anything other than he doesn't seem to be the greatest detective either. We have issues with his claim about knowing Bruce Lee, issues with him as a narrator because he's a bit celebrity obsessed, and then his detective skills on, you know, wow, this guy who looked really unhealthy died. So then he mentions, and this is all still in the introduction, he mentions that at a tribute to Ed Parker, Linda Lee, came with Adrian Marshall, someone who was Bruce's attorney at one point. And that final letter on the last day Bruce Lee was alive was written to Adrian Marshall. Okay. He mentions that although Adrian Marshall was married for over 35 years at this point, which is the late 80s, he often escorted Linda to various functions having to do with Bruce. So there's already a bit of an allegation here that Adrian was having an affair with Linda because, well, it would seem like Linda was still single at the time, but Adrian Marshall was not. And so I don't really know any. I mean, I've heard some things, but the problem is when I go, oh, I've also heard that too. The problem is I may have heard that from someone who read it in Tom Bleecker's book and is just saying it again, right? There's this problem of like sometimes when you're really into a certain topic, the information pools about that topic are very incestuous. Mm-hmm. So you might be like, yeah, I've heard this story like 5 different times. And those 5 times, those guys heard it from the same source. So these are not 5 independent verifications of something. These are just 5 people who told you the same thing that they got from the same place that you got it too. Yeah. So again, this feeds into like this feedback loop and confirmation bias. So you need to be like, even myself, where I go like, I have heard that before, but it very well could have just been someone telling me this who had read it from the book. Right. So then he continues on. Linda at this time, so it's the late 80s. So, you know, this is a solid 15 years after Bruce Lee had passed. She got an advance to write a new book about Bruce Lee from O'Hara Publications. She had previously authored Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew, this little paperback, which I have. It's very rare. It's very good. She's pretty honest in that book.
Do you have the first version where she's a bit more honest?
Yeah, of course I have the first version. I don't go and get the revisionist ones. I have like the 74, I have like the original printing, 74 one. It's very candid about Bruce and some of the things that were going on in a way that I think later editions may have been changed, or they just stopped printing that book altogether. And then she kind of pivoted a little bit in her branding of Bruce. And it's probably the first and last time Linda was ever somewhat candid about Bruce. After that, it's always just been the whitewashed version. Mm-hmm. So he also mentions that that first book, the Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew, was actually ghost-written by an English writer. He said at the time she was working as a kindergarten teacher in Torrance, California. Torrance, California is actually where I was born, by the way. Oh. And she couldn't get past the first page of the new book. So enter Tom Bleecker to come help her write this book, which would then later be called the Bruce Lee story, because Tom Bleecker is a writer. Yeah, which he will always let you know. Mm-hmm. So basically, he came in essentially to be like a ghost writer or a co-writer in this new book, because Linda was having problems writing it herself. So Tom goes on to say that he was given access to like the files and journals and, you know, the date timers, all the stuff that we would like to see. Basically, the keys of the castle as far as Bruce's personal effects were concerned. He said he saw all the journals that Bruce wrote during his back injury, all the famous notes, a lot of the stuff that would later be, I guess, part of Dao Jeet Kune Do, his rusty weight sets, and, boxing gloves and headgear and all these kind of things, and the electric shock stimulator that Bruce used to train his muscles. And then he has like this weird note about it. He says, it made him queasy to look at because it looked like some German Gestapo device. You know, and it's like, yeah, I mean, like, every like old technology always looks dated, but it's kind of weird, like It's a weird, like, bro, it's an electric stimulator. Like,
it's a very, very odd,
yeah.
like, metaphor is the wrong word, like example, you know what
Yes.
I mean?
It's like, have you been in a Gestapo room?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, and how would you know that?
Yes. And also like the association of something that someone voluntarily used for the sake of improving their musculature versus like I don't know, look, whatever. I mean, I'm not going to belabor this point, but it's just weird, all right? It's just weird.
Yeah.
So then now, so I've already discussed that like his 6-year relationship with Bruce Lee is a bit questionable. His detective work is equally questionable. And he's already thrown an allegation that there was something between, Linda and Adrian Marshall, right? So now Tom has access to all this stuff, at Linda's place, in the garage or in the storage or in the room or whatever, right? And now Tom starts asking questions as he starts going through this stuff. Now he's putting his Sherlock Holmes detective brain on, right? And I find these questions to be a mixed bag of like legit questions and some really bizarre hot nonsense. Like some of the stuff that like I would go like, really? Like you had access to all this stuff and that was the shit you were thinking about? So the first thing where we have to kind of like go like, all right, I don't know why he would think this way, but this was something that was apparently a big deal to him. All right. He found merchandising deals with a company called Ziv International, Z-I-V. He was somewhat shocked that there were merchandising deals done in Bruce's name. And I'm going like, really? I mean, like, first of all, we know a lot about Linda Lee's financial situation after the death of Bruce Lee. Bruce was in a lot of debt. Even like towards the time of his death, it seems that he may have just been kind of creaking out of it. But basically, Raymond fronted a lot of cash for him to get the house, and he gave him the car, and he did all this stuff while Bruce's films made some money and kind of, repaid Raymond and stuff like that. So we know that Bruce was like on the cusp of making money, but then he unfortunately passed away before Enter the Dragon was released and then was never able to realize that. The other thing we know is that his Chinese films, there's no Screen Actors Guild in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So he's not getting any residuals on that stuff. Bruce got paid what he got paid to make those movies, and that was it.
Yeah.
Even the Warner Brothers deal for Enter the Dragon, because they were so hesitant to put big money into this movie that would have a Chinese as the star. That's why they had to put John Saxon in co-billing, which is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
That they shot it in Hong Kong on a very low budget. Less than $1 million, like 800K tops. And because they shot it abroad, they didn't have to follow SAG guidelines, Screen Actors Guild, all right? If that even existed in the same way it does now, I'm sure it did. So that meant like the stuntmen didn't get scale. There were no residuals. There was nothing. So Bruce got paid what he got paid to do Enter the Dragon, and that was it. If that movie was the biggest thing since sliced cheese, all it would do would give him better opportunities for the next one, but he's not going to see tons of extra money flowing in based on the success of that film, which also meant that once he died, Linda is not going to now suddenly be flooded with checks from Warner Brothers because of the success of Enter the Dragon. She sold Bruce's share, which was 50% of Concord Productions, more or less at the time of his death. And Linda was kind of back at zero. Right? Mm-hmm. Now she had to start working. She had 2 kids. And this is another thing I need to mention because I do occasionally criticize Linda Lee. I do often criticize Shannon Lee. And I just want to make sure that people understand I criticize certain things they've done, either to Bruce's students or to Bruce's family, lawsuits and all sorts of very uncool things that they've done to kind of block even family members of Bruce Lee from doing their own projects about Bruce Lee. Those are things not a lot of people talk about. A lot of Jeet Kune Do instructors won't mention it because if they do, they're afraid they won't be allowed to use the name Jeet Kune Do in their schools. A lot of people very close to Bruce Lee, including his brother and sister, are very nervous about mentioning anything about Shannon or Linda because they're going to get a letter from a lawyer if they do. But I'm not a Jeet Kune Do instructor. I'm not engaged in any Bruce Lee related projects. I don't foresee that I will have to ask Shannon for anything. Famous last words. So I don't have anything to pull back on this. Okay. I know some people don't know it, maybe, but Linda and Shannon have done some very uncool things. However, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Linda just lost her husband and she has 2 small kids she needs to take care of. I can understand that as a parent. And I can separate that from any of her behaviors that happened 15 years later or in the early 90s or dealings with Bruce's students and stuff. Those are personal spats. I'm not trying to say those things should paint her in a negative light all the way through in everything she does, right? We need to look at things individually and not just as kind of black people are all good or all bad, right? I think Linda did the best. I mean, even in the things that I don't agree with her about what they did and how litigious they were against certain people, Linda, from her perspective, was doing what she most likely thought was right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's how it always is. All right. We can argue it from the sidelines, but we're not really involved. It's the way it is.
Yeah.
Having said that, what I don't understand is you have someone as like Bruce Lee as your ex-husband or as your late husband, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
He passes away. People are super duper into him. Tom Bleecker's really shocked that she wanted to get a merchandising deal. Really? What is she supposed? And he's like, he was curious whether such merchandising deals were necessary for Linda to survive financially after Bruce's death. He seriously asked himself that? First of all, we know that that's the case. Second of all, even if it wasn't, even if Linda had a great nest egg, was a trust fund baby, why would she not want to monetize her late husband's image?
Yeah.
That makes, of course she would want to do it, right? So, Bruce's image wasn't about me. Shut the fuck up. All right? Like, who's shocked about this? That's one thing. Like, look, I make fun of some of the stuff that they sell at the official Bruce Lee website, Bruce T and Be Water flip-flops, which I once jokingly said, I'm sure they have Be Water flip-flops. We went on the website. They actually did have Be Water flip-flops. I once made that up, right? Like, oh, yeah, probably Be Water flip. And lo and behold, yes, they do. But, like, Tom Bleecker is really, he's really shocked that there's a merchandising deal. I would be shocked if there wasn't one.
It just kind of attitude just kind of smacks of like that's not objective. You know what I mean? Like it's like you see this thing and like, he's adding his own kind of thing, which makes me think that it's just like there's an axe to grind. Like it's such a weird thing.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because it's not like he's picking things that are like really big and really serious. It's like weird stuff. Like, really? You think it's weird that she wanted to make money off of her super famous, legendary late husband? Are you effing kidding me? Mm-hmm. Then he said Adrian Marshall's name was attached to everything. Well, he was their lawyer. I mean, there was I heard that Bruce had fired him as the lawyer, got another lawyer. I don't know what the deal was. But I mean, if you're going to make a merchant, like if you were married to some super famous woman who passed away, would you make a merchandising deal without a lawyer being attached to that? And would you not most likely use a lawyer that, I don't know, you maybe knew really well? I get his thing, and now you start to see, like, why would Linda go to events related to Bruce Lee with Adrian Marshall? Because he's the lawyer and a friend, and he probably wants to make sure people aren't using Bruce's name in a way they shouldn't. And he might be looking for opportunities to make some deals for Linda because he's a lawyer. You don't make those deals yourself if you're not a lawyer. Maybe they had an affair or something like that, but I don't see what's so shocking about being the widow of a legendary movie star martial artist who's friends with the lawyer who helps you sign merchandising deals. I don't see where that's like a thing. All right, really? Mm-hmm. And then he asked another question, and here we get into the woo-woo part of Tom Bleecker's character, right? So already we see he's not the great Sherlock Holmes, all right? Merchandising, all right? Ed Parker was unhealthy, right? And then he asked another question. And we know this, that like when Bruce's body was sent to Seattle from Hong Kong on the plane, by the time it arrived in Seattle, there were stains in the inner lining of the coffin, like liquid and stuff had kind of leaked through, all right? So we'll see how Tom Bleecker characterized this, right? He asked how Bruce's expensive coffin had mysteriously opened during transit to Seattle, and how moisture entered the coffin and caused the dye from his dark blue suit to bleed into the coffin's white interior. All right. You know, he blames it on unsettled matters, as the Chinese would call it. And that's where you see the title of the book in the book. That's like that moment, you know, in the movie where they say the title, right? Yeah. Like I was always waiting in Total Recall for him to say, it's time for me to total recall, right? And like here we now have, it's Unsettled Matters. Dun, dun, dun. All right, the title is in the book. He said it. He said it, right? And, you know, it's as the Chinese would say. And it's like, no. First of all, the assertions are, first of all, do we even know that the coffin opened? All right, like where does that come from? Second of all, the moisture entered the coffin? No. In Marcus Ocaña's book, The Death of Bruce Lee, I can explain exactly what happened. When Bruce had his autopsy, they cut him all the way from the back. All right, from top to bottom. That's how they take the organs out and preserve the front side for the viewing of the, for the people who go to the funeral. All right, but the back is cut open, and that's where they bring all the stuff out. And he apparently said that they kind of very lazily taped him back together on the back end.
Right.
So they just put some kind of like big, maybe medical tape to put him back together, and that was it. And then you put him in a coffin. He has his funeral in Hong Kong, and then you put him on an airplane, and the fluids and liquids that are still remaining in his body are naturally going to seep out of those not completely sealed tape enclosures, right?
Right.
And it's going to stain the coffin. Unsettled Matters. Chinese woo-woo magic, right?
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. All right. And then for reference, this is a little OT, a little off topic, but Tom Bleecker has a channel, which he has some kind of crazy videos. Like Tom Bleecker responds to Bruce Lee allegations that Bruce Lee used steroids. You know why that title is so freaking disingenuous? Who made the allegations that Bruce Lee took steroids? Tom Bleecker. So, I mean, to put in the title, like, Tom Bleecker responds to allegations about alleged steroid use. It's like, bro, you're the guy who made those allegations. Mm-hmm. But do you see how clever that title is? Because he makes it seem like those allegations came from outside of himself. Now, I'm not going to say Tom Bleecker was the first or the only person to look at Bruce's physique and say, oh, he must be on some kind of PEDs. But he was the first guy to put it in a book. He was the first guy to make it open. So, I mean, it's very, like, the title, I look at that, I go, oh my God. But here's why we're just at the introduction. We're not into a lot of claims, but I need to set the stage for why I believe Mr. Bleecker is not a reliable narrator on this. We already talked about, his great non-existent detective work, his perhaps false claim that he really was Bruce's friend, his weird kind of backhanded, comments and allegations that are just like a little on the periphery, so he can always skate out of them if anyone presses him. And then here, Bruce's coffin is leaking because of Chinese spirits and all that kind of bullshit, right? Just for reference, Tom Bleecker, this is OT to the introductory chapter, he believes in psychic bullshit, okay? And I'm sorry, like, it's something you need to know. If it, again, could be the genetic fallacy. He could believe in all sorts of wooey shit. Doesn't mean that what he says about Bruce Lee is wrong, but it doesn't help. Okay. So he has a ridiculous video on his YouTube channel where it's about a psychic that got in touch with Bruce Lee's spirit in 1982. And he starts the video by saying, like, I didn't really believe in psychics until like, in the late 60s, he once went to a show by a guy named Dr. Richard Ireland, who was a psychic who did all these things with his eyes closed, and it was like a show or whatever. And I mean, I looked up that stuff, and it's like it's the typical fraud shit that was going. No, man, like I went and paid. No, man, I went and paid to see a show, and it was really convincing. Okay, sure. All right. Meanwhile, psychics still have yet to solve mysteries or any of that kind of stuff. Like, go find me a missing child, and we'll talk. Right. He then later mentions in this video that another real psychic, and he's basically telling you this psychic must be real because he believes this other psychic. So now we're talking about another psychic. He wasn't there for this thing, but he just wants you to know psychics are real because he once went to a show in LA from a psychic that impressed him. All right. And there were other people at that time he mentions, like Uri Geller. Yeah, someone we find out is a complete fraud, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, this real psychic, her name is Jenny O'Connor, and she channeled Bruce Lee in the 1980s. And she did this when some guy named John, he has a transcript of this, mind you. Not a video, not audio, he's got a transcript, right? Some guy named John, who was a martial artist, like a budding martial artist, he came to Jenny in 1992 because he had lost a family member, wanted to get in contact with a family member. So he goes over to Jenny to, talk to the beyond. And while he's there, he's like, hey, man, I got a real psychic here, right? So, geez, I got a psychic who teaches right next door, who's right next door to City Wing Chun, right? I mean, we got enough psychics here. I always wonder how those places survive with Manhattan rents. And then one of my students told me a long time ago, it was a cop. He's like, oh, those are all just money laundering fronts for drug dealers.
Yeah.
Like all the psychic, like $5, how do you afford rent in New York on a $5 reading? And he's like, oh, they're just laundering money. They're all drug dealers.
Well, my response to any time anyone asks me, like, because we would have these psychics that would come into the stores we work at, just like come in with, and they'd have a laminated card to like prove that they were
real
psychics, right? Because of course you do have that to have a psychic membership, right?
Of course.
And I'd be like, the fact that you haven't worked out what my answer to your question is
shows me you're not a psychic. And then you always go, no, that's not how it works, man. You need to believe in it for it to work. I see. Got it. All right. Yeah, it's kind of like most religions, right? So anyway, John was a martial artist, and when he visited Jenny to contact the spirits of this like deceased relative, he figured, oh, I'm here. Might as well ask her about Bruce Lee, since he himself was a martial artist. Seriously. All right. And you know how you know it's real, or at least how Tom Bleecker tells you it's real? Because Jenny didn't know who Bruce Lee was. She didn't even know this guy was like dead. All right. It's like, okay. All right. No, wait. It gets worse. All right. And it's like, why do we know this? Because she said it? Because John said it? We have a transcript. I mean, like, why do we have to believe any of this garbage, right? If I came to you with the same story, bro, you're my friend. If I was like, yo, I went to a psychic and I was asking her about like my late grandmother, and then while I was there, I'm like, yo, can you tell me something about Bruce Lee? And like, you would look at me like, what's wrong with you, right? But now imagine you're reading about someone else you don't know doing this 40 years ago, and you're getting it as a transcript. Like, oh no, this must be legit. Like, oh, of course, it's written, it's in black and white. Come on.
It's that line in Ghostbusters. It's like, so anyway, how's Elvis and what's he up to these days?
Yeah, exactly, right? So, how do we know this? Tom Bleecker told us it's good enough for me, right? And on such a low bar of evidence, we'll give full credence to someone's abilities to discuss matters with spirits Unsettled from beyond, matters. Right? Unsettled matters. Dun, 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 dun. Right, okay, Andrew, you should put that dun, dun, dun every time we say unsettled matters, right? Make him work a little bit, all right? Now, look, this video, it's hysterical and it's stupid, and no serious adult would give any credence to this. It had Bruce talking in a way that he would never talk. Like, I just recently re-listened to like the Ted Thomas interview, and you get Bruce's like phrasing and pacing, and it's like the way, but you don't understand, when you're in the spirit world, you talk like a freaking Goomba or whatever, right? And so, it's not the way he would talk, and it's, why would spirits from beyond the grave be super involved in what people do day to day? And here in the transcripts, that Bruce was surprised that anyone was looking for him, when he was contacted. Like, really? With Bruce's ego? He'd be like, yo, like, you guys, dude, I'm Bruce Lee. No one has had a seance to find anything out about me or how I died. Oh, I'm surprised. Shut up. Bruce knew that John was a beginner in martial arts and said that he was a natural. And John asked him, like, what's your advice for me to train? And Bruce recommended that he train his diaphragm. Because we know that's the exact advice Bruce Lee would give a budding martial artist, right? Mm-hmm. Some like vague generic conditioning thing. We know this true because Bruce would do like the medicine ball. That's what Tom Bleecker said. Like, we know that, he would like train his abs by, doing like having people punch him in the diaphragm or whatever. It's like, oh God, this is stretching it, right?
Well, yeah. You know who it is then? Because it wasn't Bruce Lee. It was an actor pretending to be Bruce Lee. Because only actors tell you to train your diaphragm.
Train your abs, bro. If you want to be like Bruce Lee, it's all about those abs, man. It's not about the fighting skill or the sparring or the mind or anything like that. It's about the abs, bro. Let's be honest. And then, so he didn't recommend sparring or training one with anyone of note, or, hey, go see Dan Inosanto or whatever, right? It's diaphragm training, bro. Mm-hmm. And then... when John said, mentioned something like, well, you were all about the martial arts, but like you died young, Bruce got bent out of shape. And we know this because Jenny started scribbling vigorously because, of course, she's channeling this and she has to write it down. And she's scribbling vigorously because Bruce is getting all testy, right? What do you mean I died to the martial arts? What are you talking about? Bruce said that he was murdered. Dun, 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 right? Okay, this is a video Tom Bleecker made, all right? The same guy that we're supposed to believe everything he says about in a book about Bruce Lee, right? When asked who murdered him, Bruce said, okay, Tom believes this shit is real, okay? I'm going to tell you the name of who murdered Bruce, okay?
He did not say it.
He did? He said the name. Folks, if you haven't watched it on Tom Bleecker's video, you will hear it now first on the KFG. The spirit of Bruce Lee told a psychic in 1982 that his murderer was Chong E. Itsu, a man with a half Chinese, half Japanese, and initial in the middle. Now, what's more likely, all right, that someone named Chong E. Itsu was in Hong Kong and murdered Bruce Lee, or that this was a fake Asian name that the psychic made up on the spot, not knowing much about the difference between Chinese and Japanese? Which one is more likely? Chong, C-H-O-N-G, the letter E, Itsu.
Oh my God.
Well, I'm sold. I mean, come on. If you don't believe everything Tom Bleecker has to tell you, you got to get your head checked. Chong Ijitsu. You know what that name kind of reminds me of? Ashita Kim.
Yeah, of course. Itsu, by the way, if I believe translates to the word when.
It's fucking gibberish, all right? Yes. And he said injection by hydrochloride. We now know so Bruce knew what they were injecting in him when he was murdered. Oh, that looks like hydrochloride. And then died. Come on. Oh, meanwhile, none of this shit comes up in his autopsy. Okay, all right. Awesome. Oh, but his autopsy was whitewashed, bro. See, this is how the sausage of conspiracy is made, right?
Wow.
Then he said his brother knew, because they asked him who else knew. He's like his brother, or it wasn't. And Tom was like, oh, he's not even clear. Maybe it's Betty Ting Pei's brother. It's like ridiculous. And his name was Kai Pei, another what sounds like a fake made on the spot Asian name.
Hey everyone, it's the Kung Fu Genius. Fans and practitioners all know that the wooden dummy is the most coveted tool in Wing Chun, and now you can learn all about it in my cleverly titled book, The Wooden Dummy. I wrote this guide with you, the practitioner, in mind. Rather than mystifying any of the concepts or hiding so-called secrets, I've laid it all out in meticulous detail. The book is contextualized for practitioners of any lineage of the art, not just those who come from WT. Over 300 pages in length, The Wooden Dummy breaks down every aspect from the form, about technical, historical, theoretical details, and it makes it the perfect companion for anyone who's learning the wooden dummy techniques. I've even sweetened the deal for you. If you want to get a copy of this book signed by me, just use the coupon code SIGNATURE when you purchase the unsigned copy, and you will get the signed copy at no additional cost. So go to the link below or go to citywingchun.com/shop. Look up the Wooden Dummy book. Don't miss your chance. This is definitely one of the best books I've ever written on the Wooden Dummy, and I hope you'll find it's the best book ever written on the Wooden Dummy. Get yours today. Check it out.
By the way, is it weird that we have Chong E. Itsu, all right, a kind of a Japanese, weird Chinese fake name, and now we have Kai Pei, which sounds like a Mandarin name, and Bruce spoke Cantonese. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I'm sorry, but like, this is like when your friend in middle school told you, like, I know how to speak Chinese, and just made up a bunch of random shit, and you're like,
yeah,
okay. Then Bruce said it was a drug deal gone bad, and there you have it. He said drug deal, and it was in 1982. Yo, bro, there's no way she could have known. All right. First of all, anytime anyone dies young, like a famous movie star, seemingly, they're always gonna say drugs. Mm-hmm. All right. Even the late karate legend John Blooming was like, oh, Bruce Lee died from drugs. But it doesn't mean that they say that because they knew it. It doesn't mean they knew about Bob Baker and the cocaine and stuff like that. People just reflexively say drugs. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Oh, like, he had to have been drugs. He was a movie actor. He died at 32. And okay, it ends up that they might be right. But there are also tons of people, that said he died from ninjas. There are tons of people that said the triads did it. There are tons of people who've posited all sorts of theories about Bruce Lee's death. When one of them is later proved to be correct, you go, oh, see, this person said it already. We say nothing about the psychics that said he was killed by ninjas. We say nothing about your Uncle Bob who said it was the Dimmak. All right. But if it turned out to be those things, Uncle Bob would have been correct and he would have known because he was an insider. Right? This is the problem with all of this bullshit. All right. Then, of course, he continues to ask the psychic, what else is going on? And Bruce Lee said that his brother, although even in the video, Tom Bleecker's like, not sure if it's Bruce's brother, because it's like, who else knew about him being murdered? The brother, or Betty Ting Pei's brother. It's not clear. It's also clear that the psychic also doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about. And his name was Kai Pei. You hear another weird kind of seemingly made up Asian name, and again doesn't sound like a Cantonese name, which is why it just keeps coming off like just someone who's making up Asian names in the 80s, who doesn't know much about the difference between Chinese and...
This was before Kill Bill, right? Because,
yes, this is way before Kill Bill.
Kai Pei, Pai Mei.
Yeah, well, here's the weird thing. In the Bleecker video, he says like, oh, and they said that name means something like white dove. Okay, look, my Mandarin is very basic at best, but I can make comparisons between Canton. Kai Pei as like a white dove? I'm not too sure about that. Sounds like a bunch of horse shit. Sounds like a bunch of Mugu Gai Pan as Chinese food, right? So, and again, Bruce Lee said it was a drug deal gone bad. And of course, he was taking the drugs because they made the bruises feel better. Because John was like, are you taking the drugs? And he's like, yes, because they make the bruises feel better. Now, first of all, nothing that this psychic is saying that Bruce Lee is telling her sounds like how Bruce Lee talked.
Yeah.
Okay. One admitting about the drugs, one being surprised that anyone wanted to talk to him, two being extremely vague about people, Kai Pei, my brother, no Betty's brother. It reminds me again of that kind of cold reading shit that they did. They made fun of it in South Park, as we talked about, but it was that John Edwards. Who was that guy?
Yeah, it was John Edwards.
Right. He was that douchebag who would just bullshit people that he was talking to their loved ones. It's so disgusting.
So what's it? Like someone in the room, someone's recently had a death, like maybe like a grandparent.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Yeah. So easy, like
in a room full of people.
In a room full of people who didn't lose a grandparent.
What
recently.
are the odds?
Yeah. So it was like, I'm hearing like a D, dad. Yeah, dad. And it's like they're getting the cues from the people, as if you imagine. Okay, you're a ghost in the spirit realm. Okay, you have passed on. You are now deciding that the best place for you to hang out is near where a psychic is. Right? Because you wouldn't just hang out in the room or like your house or something like that. You would walk to wherever the psychics were.
Well, I've seen ghosts.
Yeah, see, that's how it works, right? You go to Whoopi Goldberg, right?
Absolutely.
And when you're asked, because of course this is communication between the material world and the spiritual world, there's obviously, I always feel like it must be like talking into a bucket. Like it's like very echoey, things are not very clear. So like, are the spirits going, da, 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 and then someone says, Dad, yes, Dad. I mean, like, why are the spirits so vague? It sounds a lot like the person who's pretending to talk to spirits is vague and you're filling in all the bullshit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bruce is naming Chong Itsu as his murderer. All right? Sounds like the kind of people who are either members of the triads or would be in Hong Kong to murder Bruce. You know, that good old Chong Itsu. You know what I'm thinking? We should make a Kung Fu Genius shirt where it just says, where it's a wanted poster for Chong Itsu.
And Chong Itsu sounded like he could have been the token Yakuza member in Raw Deal.
And we all know the high level of writing that went into that film.
Oh, yeah.
So, but of course now, you have the whole thing about the drugs, and that he was taking drugs. So obviously, in light of what we know now, clearly this psychic was onto something, right? I mean, obviously, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the weird thing is that it's like now we have this confirmation bias because we can go back to some bullshit manuscript, some bullshit transcript of a supposed interaction between a guy named a John, he's going to a prostitute, a John and a psychic who communicated with Bruce Lee back in 82. And now that we know that drugs were involved at the time of Bruce Lee's death, see, things that every time someone dies prematurely, especially in Hollywood, people would almost reflexively say drugs. And it might be drugs. It might not be. People also said ninjas killed him. People also said the triads killed him. People also said he got headaches and got cerebral edema because he hit himself with the nunchuck too many times in the head. I remember one of my cousins in the 80s. She's a dentist, so she's like a very educated person. And I was getting into Bruce Lee. She's like, oh, you know why Bruce Lee died? This had to have been mid-80s, right?
No.
It's like, yeah, because, when he was practicing with the nunchucks, he had accidentally hit himself in the head so many times that, that's like the reason why he got the headache and stuff. So the thing is, bro, I grew up in the 80s, okay? The 80s was when Bruce Lee had his big resurgence because the movies came out on VHS.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone and their sister had a Bruce Lee death theory. And when I was a kid, people were like, oh, Alex, he's into Bruce Lee. Oh, Bruce Lee died, yeah, ninjas killed him, right? Some karate guy who didn't like that he was teaching the secrets, gave him the old death touch on the back of the head when he wasn't looking, right? There were so many theories. I mean, there was the stuff, obviously, people who are in the know probably believe the standard story that he had taken an equagesic pill for a headache, and then that headache, it turned into brain swelling and so on and so forth. Most people kind of thought it was some version of that. Not a lot of people were really privy to a lot of the details, but because it was Bruce Lee, because he died so young, there was all sorts of stuff. John Blooming was like one of the most famous Kyokushin karate practitioners in Holland. Very tough guy, very serious guy. A kind of guy who always spoke his mind. He also said, oh, Bruce Lee died from drugs. And the thing is, John Blooming didn't know that because he knew about the Bob Baker letters, or that he knew that Bruce was taking cocaine, or he didn't know that stuff. He wasn't privy to it because no one was.
Yeah.
Even people who are very close to Bruce Lee didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So why would John Blooming, some karate guy from Holland, know about it? No, because everyone had a theory.
Right.
From ninjas to foul play to triads to drugs to nunchucks hitting him in the head. Okay? And if there are enough theories floating around, someone is statistically bound to be right by accident. I remember when the drug letters came out, people were like, John Blooming said he was on drugs and that's why he died. Hey, John Blooming was a badass, but he would have just figured it. I mean, clearly he guessed right because Bruce was a young guy, died at 32, was in the Hollywood movie scene. Okay, it's reasonable to assume, even though there really was not a whole lot of evidence, unless you thought cannabis did it, which it clearly didn't. And it was funny because when you read the inquest stuff, at some point they were clearly trying to pin the very low levels of cannabis Bruce had as potentially being one of the things that caused the cerebral edema. And even at that time, there was a lot of like hysteria about drugs and stuff, especially like marijuana and stuff. And even then, like when you look at the inquest and you look at the papers, like even the doctors were like, yeah, we can't find a single study where marijuana has killed anyone. We can't find a single study where like this has actually caused brain swelling or any of this stuff. They're like, yeah, this theory just doesn't really make any sense, right?
I mean, the thing I'll say about the John Blooming thing is that, there's an argument to be made that his could be an educated guess because he's from Holland, which has always famously been very, very, I wouldn't say pro substance abuse, but the hash cafes, it's very easy to buy like cocaine and ecstasy on the street. And it's like, it's essentially decriminalized, right?
Sure.
So a guy like that could look at, let's say he liked Bruce Lee and it genuinely liked him in the 70s.
Oh, I always get the impression he wasn't a Bruce Lee fan because it was very like us versus them in the 70s, right?
Right.
Like he you definitely get the impression because he thought the only badass martial artist out there was Masoyama, the guy that he learned from.
Okay, fair.
And so you also have the feeling he's also just trying to kick Bruce down a peg because everyone thinks Bruce Lee's the greatest, and he's like, oh, I'm the real fighter here. Who's this Bruce Lee twerp? No, I mean, it could have been a very educated guess, but the thing that's like difficult to explain to people in the comments is that, yeah, he might be right, but not because he knew.
Yeah.
He just guessed.
Yeah.
And it could have been an educated guess, but until you actually have the evidence to say, yes, it seems to have been something related to drugs, you can't say, yeah, just because it might be, right?
Yeah, it's the difference between being, yeah, he died because of drugs. And in my opinion, looking at like what I can see from the outside, I think it might be drugs, but I have no evidence of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was weird because it was like such a trope about like, oh, John Blooming got it right. And it's like, okay, but I've read a lot about John Blooming, and Sifu Kernspect also knew John Blooming very well. And so it was like, yeah, but he's not getting this information. He's not like a Bruce Lee insider, right? And people can be very wrong about these kind of things. I mean, I don't know if you remember like a number of years ago when Brittany Murphy died.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was like, oh, it was a drug overdose. The drug overdose. Like, and that was like, it was like already that. Why? Because Young died suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Turns out it was like pneumonia because there was like mold spores in her house or something like that. Something to that effect, right? And so the thing is, it's very easy to be wrong about these things. And it's very easy, even if you're close to the source, to be wrong about something. As a matter of fact, our boy Dwight Woods, who we recently had on the podcast, he posted something that said it's possible to be close to the source and still be wrong. And he posted a video of Brandon Lee quoting his father, but it was actually one of those quotes that came after his father passed away that was like attributed to his father.
Right.
But that's the son of Bruce Lee saying, oh, my father said.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is, like, you always have to be very careful, including when people listen to me. You know, if people don't agree with something I say, or they're not sure if one of the facts or something that I said is correct, and I'm totally, I mean, like, we're only human. I may misspeak no matter how much I prepare. Feel free to look it up. And then if I make a mistake, put in the comments and tell me how I made a mistake. Don't just go, John Blooming was right. It's like, okay. I also heard that, Sal down the street was like, I'll tell you how Bruce Lee died. It was drugs. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, Sal didn't know anything about Bob Baker. He didn't know about it. He just guessed it. All right. Yeah, all these Hollywood guys are all taking drugs. All right.
No, I actually misspoke on an episode where I was talking about the Hendrix story, and I re-listened to the episode, and I said that Hendrix's dodgy manager Mike Jeffries died 3 years ago. What I actually meant to say was he died 3 years after Hendrix.
Oh yes.
And I kind of half expected someone to pick me up on that, but no, dude died in the 70s, and I'd be like, of course, I misspoke because I was
our audience is so sequestered into the world of Wing Chun and Bruce Lee. Yeah, whenever I misspeak on all sorts of other things, like outside of what we normally talk about, I almost get no pushback. They realize how highly specialized our audience is. Like, ask me anything about Bong Sao or Bruce Lee, but you ask me about how to, you boil eggs, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, then there were other names that were mentioned by Bruce as people who are somehow involved in this drug dealing gone bad.
No, this is Bruce in the Netherworld.
Bruce in the Netherworld.
Yeah.
So Bruce in the Netherworld. So we've already thankfully through Tom Bleecker, we've been able to get these gems directly from he himself, Bruce Lee, from the ethereal world in 1982. The Beyond. We got the name Chong Yi-Itsu. Mm-hmm. Very important.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, we're going to Hong Kong in a couple of weeks. I think we should go to the Hong Kong police and mention this 1982 psychic said that Chong Yi-Itsu shot Bruce Lee with hydrochloride. I mean, they would probably just reopen the case based on that.
So here's the thing: I've been learning Japanese for the last year.
Mm-hmm.
Doing great, but doing it, then getting the kind of idea how the sentence structure is, right? Mm-hmm. And it's often backwards. So it's sort of like kind of say, if you say where where is the convenience store?
Mhm.
It would be like kind of convenience store where is,
Yes.
right? So Chong.
It's the same in Chinese, by the way.
Okay, well that's
Yeah.
good to know. So Chong, Tommy Chong, drugs.
Ooh.
E, I mean, could be an is of some kind. Itsu, when is drugs?
Ooh. Yeah.
See how this
There
is
you go.
working?
There you go.
Yeah.
We solved it.
Absolutely.
Bruce Lee was shot by hydrochloride by when is drugs.
Mm-hmm.
It all makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom Bleecker, for letting us know what that psychic said. This has brought us so much further. But the other names that were named by Bruce Lee are equally hysterical to our Mandarin Kai Pei and our half Mexican, half Chinese, Japanese injector of hydrochloride, Feng Kyoto.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, so here's the thing. I would like for people to think I'm just pulling shit out of my ass. Go ahead and watch Tom Bleecker's video about the psychic. All right, that talked to. And first of all, listen to how and again, it's the host of logical fallacies.
Right.
It's the psychics are real because I had a real experience with this one psychic once. Therefore, this psychic must be real. Therefore, this story must be totally true. Here, I'm going to read you a transcript instead of any of the people who are actually involved talking about it, as if that would even make it more plausible. But it's like a secondhand story of something we don't even know really happened. And it is Feng Kyoto. Okay? This Jenny O'Connor, dude, I'm in the wrong business, man. I need to just be some bullshit psychic. Because I could do much better if someone came to me and, let's say, they wanted to talk to the spirit of Bruce Lee. I wouldn't come up with fake-ass Asian names like Feng Kyoto. Like, it's the 80s. This was some, like, American psychic who doesn't know Chinese versus Japanese is pulling these names. Feng Kyoto. And the other one was Mai Pei, which is like...
Wait, so Kai Pei, my pay.
Yeah. And if you just flipped it, it would be Pai Mei, man. It was so close to being... White eyebrow killed Wing Chun, right? I'm really surprised there's no Ishida Kim. Mm-hmm. So in any case, the reason why I took this little detour into the world of this weird psychic video is because I just want people to see some of the cracks. Now, this is, again, like, it's going to sound repetitive. I don't want to follow the genetic fallacy that because Tom Bleecker is clearly a bad detective, Tom Bleecker may have made some claims like being buddy-buddy with someone for 6 years for which there's no evidence, for which there should be evidence. He may be easily, he may easily believe in things like psychics talking to Bruce. And then think about it. Like, even if you were like, okay, what did this psychic say? Anyone who would read this transcript, who knew anything about Bruce Lee, like, oh, that's totally fake. Like, that's total bullshit. What are these half Japanese, half bullshit names here? All right. But no, he's like, see, like, there's something there. There's a there. And so anyway, I bring this up to kind of let people see that with the amount of fervor and emotion and just like the certainty people have in just putting in the comments, like the stuff that Tom Bleecker put in his book. Oh, his kidneys were failing. Oh, the diuretics. Oh, the cortisone. Oh, the butler did it, or whatever. What he was. It's not even clear what he's accusing Wong An of. And although now, after the drug letters came out, we actually know what the deal with the butler was, and he clearly. It's funny because you can tell. He knew something was up with the butler. The butler, as we know, is the one who Bob Baker was sending all the drugs to Wong An. And so there's like, the butler, what's the deal with the butler? And see, he didn't know it. He didn't know that. He knew Bob Baker supplied Bruce with drugs, but as far as he could tell, it was cannabis. Mm-hmm. All right?
Yeah.
And he knew that somehow the butler had something to do, but he didn't know. So he's really not quite the insider at that time that he should be. Given what we know now, we can see what he didn't know. And it calls into question how much of an expert he really wants to kind of claim that he is on these things, not to mention these major problems with the way he generally goes about doing research. He literally believes in fucking psychics who make up names like Chong-i Itsu and Feng Kyoto. I cannot repeat that enough. This is very problematic when you want to say, bro, mic drop. Tom Bleecker is the one who's going to tell you everything that happened at the end of the day. He literally believes in magical thinking, psychic nonsense, and unfounded conspiracies. All right. And people need to understand this when reading his book or listening to anything that he has to say. Now, again, it doesn't mean that everything's bullshit. It just means most of it might be. But it means that many of his statements, all right, need to be vetted before you just put in the comments, oh, Bruce's kidneys, oh, the diuretics, oh, the cortisone, oh, the butler was dodgy. Somehow that has something to do with it. Look a little bit deeper before you just say, well, it's in Tom Bleecker's book, because we have issues with how Tom Bleecker looks at evidence and very clearly what Tom Bleecker believes is the bar for actual evidence, right? So anyway, we come back to the book. We're almost done here with the introduction. He later goes on to believe that he believes the autopsy and the coroner inquest had been a whitewash. I don't totally disagree with that. There are certain things in the autopsy. I don't think the autopsy is whitewashed. I think there were certain things that were done. We've talked about it. This is now getting into that weird line of the things I'm not really going to talk about Bruce Lee's death, because you know why. You know the information I have.
Yep.
I'm just going to say that maybe certain things were done just to make sure that certain things weren't on there, but that doesn't mean that what was on there was faked. It just means it's maybe perhaps more a sin of omission.
It's not lying. It's being economical with the truth.
Yes, spoken so well, man. So he believes that it was a whitewash. I believe there's some truth to it not being 100% correct, but I don't believe there's a grand conspiracy to fake everything when you know what was maybe omitted and why and how and by whom. You go, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not that big of a stretch.
Well, exactly. But bearing in mind, we know exactly how the process was done. The argument can be made that actually it is 100% correct.
Yes.
Given the evidence that was given.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
We have to be very careful not to trip, because I made that video a year ago. I'm not going to talk about Bruce Lee's death. And we've made like 3 more videos where we kind of talked about it. But there's a couple pieces can't talk about. All right. Yeah. So anyway, so finally kind of wrapping up in this introduction section, he then goes on to say that there was a clause in the agreement about Bruce Lee's biopic, Dragging the Bruce Lee Story. So, he had access to all these things and stuff. And he actually put the clause in there. So I'm going to read it.
Yeah. So this is where it comes right at the beginning.
Well, so yes, this is perhaps the beginning of where the salt was made. So the company agrees that no publication or theatrical or television motion picture hereunder shall make any reference to 1, the use of marijuana by Bruce Lee, 2, to sexual or romantic relationships between Bruce Lee and any other woman other than his wife during the years of his marriage, or 3, to any unsavory or illicit circumstances surrounding his death. So this seems to have been like in a contract in the pre-development phase, because they talk about theatrical, television, motion picture. So clearly something was signed that people had the rights to do something with Bruce Lee's story. So this is probably very preliminary to actually being in Dragging the Bruce Lee Story. And he puts this in there like, see? But, he also wrote, it was in this last instruction to avoid specific elements of Bruce Lee's demise that I found particularly disturbing. So here's where I go. This is a little bit like when he was shocked that there was a merchandising deal. It's like, oh my God,
Linda Lee wanted to merchandise Bruce Lee. That's weird. Did she need that like for money and the kids? Like, it's like,
Yes.
it's like, oh, you know, we should buy him a little Sherlock hat and give him a little fake pipe or something like that. Sherlock had a pipe, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, okay. Yeah, we give him a little pipe like that, right? Like, oh, okay. Cute. All right, really cute. All right. But here's the weird thing, okay? I don't think it's totally out, like knowing what we know now about Bruce's drug use, especially at the end there and the Baker letters and everything like that. I don't think it's unreasonable for Linda to want to make a movie or whatever about her husband and not talk about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He's known as a martial artist. His achievements were through film and TV and creating Jeet Kune Do and teaching all these martial arts. I mean, like, yeah, why would you want to like throw that stuff in there, even if it was in there? Like, as much, like I said, as much as I'm occasionally critical about Linda and Shannon Lee, I'm like, I don't see that as a big deal.
No.
Do you really want to make a movie where you're talking about all the weird illicit stuff that happened? I mean, like, is that the movie you even want to make when you have the IP of Bruce Lee?
Mm-hmm.
No. All right. It's something better for like a Matt Pauly book or for us to talk about on this podcast, right? But I mean, as far as a movie goes, no, you want to see Bruce Lee's life in a kick-ass kind of way, and for better or worse, that's what Dragon the Bruce Lee story was, right? So, but again, it's like he's like putting in this like, do you see what was in the contract? And I look at this and I go like, there's nothing weird. Like I totally understand why, one, Linda wouldn't want to harp on the drug use. Two, why she would want to bring up the affairs and all that kind of stuff, and why she would want to like discuss salacious or nefarious things regarding her husband's death when his life was so awesome. Like, none of that stuff. It's like, but you see, obviously, okay, obviously, what she's gonna put the real thing in a movie, and then everyone's gonna know it, and then, or she's afraid that the movie company's gonna know about it, put it in the movie, and then the cat's out. I mean, it's kind of dumb.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of ridiculous to think that this was weird.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think you should kind of notice here is that we now know through the drug letters that Linda was very much involved in the cocaine stuff. Not whether she used it, perhaps she did, I don't know. But she wrote some of the letters to Bob Baker. On the backside, it was Linda Lee's handwriting about getting the scale and making sure there's enough C and stuff. So she was implicated in getting cocaine over in her own words.
Yeah.
So Linda was fully aware of Bruce's cocaine habit. No one could say that Bruce was writing these letters directly to Bob. Bob was sending it care of Wong to the Golden Harvest Studios to the Golden Harvest office on Nathan Road. And Linda didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Linda very clearly knew about it. In fact, there's that one infamous letter where Bob Baker was like, are you sure Bruce isn't overdoing it? And she was like, no, he's fine. So one could make a case, although again, we don't know what really happened, but one could make a case that she was also enabling Bruce on this habit here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But when his autopsy came out, the only thing that they found was and people make a big deal out of it. Oh, it was the Nepalese hash or whatever. When you read his autopsy, actually the level of THC, the cannabinoids that were in his system, was extremely small. And we know that Bruce was kind of a heavy user of marijuana. So it seemed that literally around the time of his death, he had not used it that much. Because they said it was like trace amounts, like as if there was just a little bit in a cup of tea that he drank. So it was almost like it couldn't have been, and it couldn't have been at those amounts. But they kind of seemed like they wanted to pin it maybe on that for some reason, although they had to see what the deal was with the insurance claim and stuff. But they want to say, okay, maybe some kind of reaction to the cannabis, right? And even the doctors were like, no. Yeah. We don't have anything in the literature that would suggest that, and the amounts that Bruce Lee had. I'm fairly convinced he had far more cannabis or hash or whatever you want to call it in his system on the May 10th collapse, because he actually took some while he was wigging out. But apparently on the day that he died, he didn't have that much.
Mm-hmm.
but it was the only thing of note that showed up on his autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing now that we know that Linda knew about the cocaine, and then she puts in this thing, don't talk about the marijuana. It also seems like she's trying to hide in plain sight by putting this other thing out there. Don't talk about the marijuana, because no one is even mentioning any of the other stuff because they didn't know it.
Yeah.
So it's like she's it's like the Chinese say to cast a brick to get jade.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she concedes something so that you're like, well, they're open that there was a there.
Oh yeah, no.
But it was cannabis. It wasn't anything else.
It's the sleight of hand. It's like, hey, don't look at this thing over here that I'm showing you.
Yes.
When there's the big pile of cocaine on the mirror over there.
Exactly. All right. So much so that it even made up there. Now, Tom Bleecker did not know about that back then. So now I look at that and I go, oh, yeah, they were saying like, please don't talk about the marijuana.
Yeah.
Because if that were to ever come out, it would be the least that they would ever have to even worry about. Who the hell cares about someone who used weed in the 70s? Who gives a shit?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Absolutely.
And so it's very clear that, but he's like, oh, but the fact that they didn't want to discuss unsavory or illicit circumstances surrounding his death, he makes it seem like Linda knows that there were illicit circumstances surrounding his death and doesn't want to talk about that. It's like, no, the unsavory or illicit circumstances surrounding his death is all the shit that was in the newspapers. Yeah. It was all the tabloid stuff. It's very clear from this. It's like, no, don't talk about the triads killing him or death touch or all of that kind of bullshit that was in the newspapers.
Yeah.
Not because there was actually something that went on and she knows about it. Don't talk about that. Don't talk about the marijuana. Don't talk about the affairs. Don't talk about the unsavory things I don't want you to know about. Like, it's like you have the data points, the clause from the contract, and then you have the interpretation, and he's making a big deal of this thing, and I'm going like, this looks pretty pro forma.
Yeah, it's very standard.
Very standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, at the end of the intro, and I think what anyone who is consuming this book by Bleecker needs to know, as we've mentioned, is that then he goes on to say how many times he wanted to quit working on the Bruce Lee storybook. Do you know why?
Oh, please enlighten me. I want to know.
Because he fell in love with Linda. And he had conflicts because this biography he's writing about her former husband, who was also
a certifiable legend,
who was also his close friend. Let us not forget.
Oh, yes.
Let us not go back to that first claim that we talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
His close friend, for which he has no photos, no daytimer entries that we could see. Of course, we don't know everything that's in all of Bruce Lee's daytimers. No letters. No nothing.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't have a letter. Otherwise, he would post it.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have a photo. Otherwise, he would post it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But they were close friends. So you can understand his conflict, right? He's writing a book about a legend. And that legend used to be his friend. But he's writing it with that legend's widow, who he's now falling in love with. Do you see the conflict? It's like a drama. You could write a book about this. This is juicy.
Oh, yeah.
This is salacious.
In fact, let's write a book about it.
Yes.
And call it Unsettled Matters.
Dun, dun, dun. They married in 1988 and had a brief marriage because of the, and I shit thee not, unsettled matters the Chinese spoke of. You put...
No.
He threw that nugget in there.
He 100% did not do that.
Okay, I will pull it up. You just wait right there. Okay. I shit thee not. All right. So, he's talking about this wonderful budding romance that was too quickly sweeping us both off of our feet. Ooh. And then here we go. So I was not making that up. I wasn't just putting that to put in the phrase unsettled matters dun, 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 in the book. Oh, he said it. He said it again.
He said it.
Yeah, I'll read it to you. Our serendipitous coming together had a true storybook ending, and Linda and I were married in the summer of 1988. Oh, it was a great year. Our honeymoon would be short-lived, however. Ostensibly, the unsettled matters that the Chinese people had warned about inevitably took a death grip on our marriage and simply would not let go. Ultimately, Linda and I could not resolve several devastating issues, and our brief marriage ended in divorce. Unsettled matters that the Chinese had warned about. Where did they warn about?
Yeah, which one?
Where was this warning?
Yeah.
All right, I've been to Hong Kong a bunch of times. I've received no warnings of unsettled matters.
I'm pretty sure it's on Temple Street.
It could be, yeah.
I think so.
Do you know about the unsettled matters? No, please tell me. There are many unsettled matters.
You know,
all right?
it's a bar on Temple Street, and they warn you not to go to it.
Yeah, it actually isn't the name of that bar Unsettled Matters. It sounds like it sounds like a name of a bar that would be on Temple Street in Hong Kong, right? And but it's so fun. It's also kind of weird. Like, it wasn't that they couldn't get along.
Mm-hmm.
It was that it was an external force.
Yes, of course.
It was this wind that came because of Bruce Lee and the spirit. He was like, no, you will not be with my widow because there are unsettled matters, because I secretly need you, Tom, to set the record straight so people will know the reason of my death, and I can finally relax and rest and my spirit can be at ease. And that's all I got to say about that. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of The Kung Fu Genius. As always, don't forget to subscribe to The Kung Fu Genius. Hit that bell for notifications. Let me know if you like this kind of content. Support us on Patreon or here on YouTube through memberships. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.
Word is I'm a kung fu genius. Technique speaks for me, not lineage. Forget Jet Li, cause I'm the one. Many call me seafood, but to you I'm sea kung. And I produce masters. You surpassed us. Your kung fu stiffer than corpse and caskets. City Wing Chun is the house I built. Violate the gate and your blood gets spilled. Alex, Richter, always the victor.
Ready?
Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Jesus. Let's do that one more time. 1, 2, 3.
Because we didn't make a joke about Dre having the clap, and it just threw me off.
I know, we're used to making some STD related joke.
All right, peeps. On today's episode of
The jacuzzi.
the jacuzzi incident.
The jacuzzi incident.
That's going to be my podcast.
All right, governor. Knock him on the head.
Go, blimey, governor.